Hello, good evening, and welcome to the fifth edition of the Goa Arts and Literature Festival at the International Centre Goa. Today, here we have with us an esteemed, writer in our presence, Sir Edwin Thumboo, who is also the Emeritus Professor at the National University of Singapore and has been the longest-serving Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And he's also been regarded as the unofficial poet laureate of Singapore himself. I'm glad, sir, to have you. We're really honored here. Thank you so much for coming here. And sir, if we can start off with your academic journey that started back in the 1970s as such. You called yourself a myth-inspired poet. Can you please tell us what exactly you meant by that?
I think every culture has at its core myths, because myths embody important psychological, if not religious, truths for that society. And myths normally depict fundamental values and a fundamental experience for that society. Now, Singapore, as you know, is a multicultural, multiracial society. And when you have that kind of origin, more of the myths that you have are located outside Singapore. They will be in India, they'll be in China, they'll be in parts of Indonesia, the whole of the Southeast Asian area. And I felt that every society needs some myths. And Singapore itself has had very few myths, or legends for that matter. We have only one or two. And as a student of English literature, I studied modern poetry and realized the extent to which myths have inspired some of the great literature in English. And the two classic examples would be Yeats and Eliot, each of whom used myth in a different way. Eliot, for instance, as you know, in The Wasteland, he was influenced to a great extent by the vegetation myth, the myth of rebirth, the myth of a land that is bereft of health because of dying god and so on. But I found Yeats's poetry more congenial. Eliot seemed very cerebral, and so on. So I started having mythic elements in what I wrote.
If I may quote from your poetry, Ulysses by the Marillion, you said, met strange people singing new myths, made myths myself. So in which way did you create those myths? I mean, your poetry is outstanding in the way it has been written, but...
See, I used Ulysses as a mask. Yes. The visitor usually is better able to describe what you are. So in this case, Ulysses, who is a great traveler, I use him as a mask, the kind of archetypal visitor, the man of tremendous experience. So made myths myself is Ulysses talking about his own life. As you know, he fought in the Trojan War. He was returning to Ithaca, and he had been granted this boon. The winds had been tied up in a bag. And when he reached home, somebody opened the bag and the winds came out, and then that started his wanderings. So I don't invent myths. What I do is to take them as they exist. Like, for instance, I have a poem which I wrote for Raja Rao, your novelist, where I talk about Krishna. As you know, Krishna is seen with gopis. And I think the first Europeans who came here, or the British, and especially those that are heavily Christian, they thought that, look at this terrible sort of sinful place, etc., etc. But as far as I'm concerned, all the gopis were really the multiplication of one gopi. It was love, etc., etc., noble sentiments. And I've also used myths and legends from China, from any source that is useful. And the difference, of course, is this. Last 10 years or so, I've started writing poems on biblical themes. Now, as a Christian, those are not myths. For me, when you become a Christian, that becomes belief, becomes a sacred. So I've always tapped these larger structures, these larger metaphors.
You also said that history enters your writing.
Yes.
Unconsciously or consciously, you need to re-inscribe yourself as an individual.
Yes.
Because you're part of a multiracial society.
Yes.
Looking at Singapore, the place where you come from, don't you think sometimes, because it had a colonial past, just like we share in India, that history can be manipulated, and it has been done in the writings?
All the more reason why we have to re-manipulate the thing and put it right.
So, can I just shift the camera so that
Sure, you can.
So,
Because history has been manipulated. You see, history is normally written by those in power. And the word, for instance, post-colonial, which many people use, it's a terrible phrase. Once you use the word of the term post-colonial in your approach to the study of anything, you are tying yourself to colonial. That means the assumptions, the directions are colonial. We are moving away from colonial. So I'm not post-colonial. We are not post-colonial. Post meaning after. Who were colonial? It is the colonizing powers of colonial. We weren't colonial. We were the victims of colonialism. So we are what? National, post-national. All right? And I wouldn't say, I don't like the word post. Post meaning after. Historical processes are very long. Very, very long. So when you say post, it's too recent. It's too recent. I can say this, the post-Gandhian era. Fair enough, because Gandhi lived for that phrase. Or you can say this is the post-Nehru era. All right? Now perhaps, you can see how the word post should apply.
further down, sir, you say in your poetry that history enters your own writing, and it's important, you say, that we need history to reinscribe ourselves as individuals of multiracial society. So you come from Singapore, which has been under colonial rule. So don't you think sometimes history is manipulated to a great extent, especially when it's been under a colonial power in the past?
I have a historical perspective, and you can't avoid it. You can't avoid it. My generation couldn't avoid it. We were the victims of history. Okay, we are also the children of history. When we start writing our own history, my country is now going to celebrate its 50th anniversary, and I'm in a curious position of being older than my country. All right, and when we see what has happened from the time we started, say in 1960, our per capita income was only 5,000 US. Now, it is 60,000 US. And we are second in the world. And that is a very frightening thought. We are on a treadmill. How do we get off? All right? We are comfortable, we are flourishing, etc. And you see, but also I think history is important because it's only through history that you have a sense of your own identity. You know, the composition of your own culture, the way it moved.
You also go on to say in your books, Gods Must Die, in the 1970s, that, literature plays an integral role in shaping up nationalism. How do you see it happening in the way you've worked with Singaporean literature?
By embodying its sentiment, by putting it in language that is memorable. Now remember, the best, and perhaps from some points of view, the people who are anti-nationalist or who don't believe in nationalism would disagree with me, but it doesn't matter. The best nationalism ultimately is embodied in your anthem. And your anthem is song. And song is poetry. So, you also have to see, poetry embodies the best language a culture is capable of. I'm not saying that fiction hasn't got good language, it has. but the kind of language. You see, poetry. The point of poetry is to say more with less. Correct.
And maybe in a very convincing manner more than fiction, would you say?
Persuasive and also memorable manner. Memorable manner. That's why it's easier to learn poetry by heart than fiction. Right? And even if you read, even if you read fiction, let's say Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I read that about 60 years ago, or more, 70 years ago. No, 65. No, that's beautiful. All these years I still remember it, not because of anything, but because it's beautiful language. Right?
You've also.
And when we quote, we don't quote fiction, we quote poetry. Sorry, yeah.
I was coming on to your efforts with the National University Singapore Centre for Arts, where you've worked extensively trying to kind of, propagate and cultivate a love for Singaporean literature. How do you see it coming now? Because
it's flourishing. It's flourishing. But my one concern is that it should really be a bit more patient, perhaps, spend more time revising. In other words, it must be the strongest writing possible by the poets, especially. For me, there's no such thing as a finished poem. It's always in the future. You revise and you revise and you revise. Now, the poem I read last night, I should say many, quite a few people have asked me to send them a copy. And I said, no, not yet. I want to revise it. I want to revise it, and I want the experience of the last few days or for the next few days will be a part of the process of revision.
Somewhere down the line, it's also homecoming for you, since your father was an Indian. How does it feel being here at the Goa Art and Literary Festival?
But Goa is unique, you see. Goa, I suppose you could say that of every part of India. But Goa is unique here because you were a colony of Portugal for a very long time. But from what and this is why the visit is important, because many of the, as I said last night, many of the preconceptions I had, or many of the understanding I have had to be revised, because I thought Goa was an invention of Portugal. That's nonsense. Goa was part of Indian history right from the beginning. The Sumerians came, and the proof is absolute for that. And you remained Indian. You have Portuguese moments, all right. The greatest of them was the coming of Christianity, right? But Goa is completely Indian, and Indian in a very special way. How the Brahmins converted, etc. And you remain quintessentially Indian in many ways. But because of this contact, the Indianness is special, is unique, but Indian still.
Thank you for reiterating that. Now, since you've been working with young people at the Centre for Arts, how do you think you can create that love and interest for your own literature? Because even in Indian literature, for the matter of fact, it's difficult because there are so many more new things and new ways of writing and thinking that are evolving. So how do you develop that interest in young minds today?
Young minds have no problem. These are the young people I don't have to develop. The interest is there. The excitement is there. The necessary catalyst, the necessary support has been put in by the National Arts Council, who incidentally supported not only my visit here, but also the visit of Mr. Isa Kamari and a young poet called Joshua Ip. Now, the National Arts Council has done a lot. It's got its own dynamics. But we, I think, have the kind of syndrome, maybe that's too strong a word. We tend not to take our own literature with the seriousness it deserves and it requires. There's always the feeling that, the overseas people, etc., are better, which is not true. Because looking at it objectively, we know how strong our writing is, or our writing can be. So academe quite often takes a bit of time to catch up. Like, for instance, the study of Indian literature. If not for the work of professor like Professor Iyengar, who wrote that big book, and there are others, people like Professor C.D. Narasimhaya, to push the study of Indian literature, it would have taken much longer.
So, would you have a message to give maybe young people who want to get into the profession of writing across ages? I mean, what would you have to say?
I would say trust yourself, be humble, learn the word, the power of words, experiment, try and try and try, and don't be too satisfied with the writing too easily.
That's really beautifully put, and I thank you, sir, so much for taking out time here to give us this lovely interview, and I'm sure all the viewers will be really intrigued by the way it was put forth. So there are many more interviews coming up at the 5th edition of Goa Arts and Literature Festival. Thank you.